Hi, Library 2.0, Steve Albrecht here. I'm with Dr. Mark West. Mark is a professor of English at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. We're talking with him today about his book, Theodore Roosevelt and his library at Sagamore Hill, which was where he lived and had his long life there. And so Teddy Roosevelt's always been a very interesting character to me. Dr. Mark West has a number of books out, including two books on that are kind of related to this, which we'll talk about. The companion book to the Sagamore Hill book. Mark, thanks for being with us today on Library 2.0.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I always like talking about TR.
And as a subject, Teddy Roosevelt, you think about FDR, being so well known for the war years and the multiple presidencies and his life in that such a historic time. Why do you think Teddy Roosevelt has resonated with people? Books, documentaries, photos and memes on the internet. Why do you think he's resonated so well?
Well, Theodore Roosevelt lived a very multifaceted and colorful life. So no matter really what you're interested in, you can almost find a way to relate it to Theodore Roosevelt. So if you're an outdoors person, you can relate to Theodore Roosevelt in his camping and his hunting and all of that sort of thing. If you are, like me, a book-oriented person, well, then you can resonate with that side of Theodore Roosevelt. If you're really interested in politics, well, he was one of the most influential politicians that we've ever had in this country. If you're interested in military history, he has a really strong background in that, especially in the naval area. But, that whole business about the Rough Riders, that appeals to a lot of people. So I think one of the reasons why he is still an interesting person to many people is that there are so many different sides to him, and they're authentic. They are actual things that were important to him. And so you can figure out a way to hang your own hat on Theodore Roosevelt hook, and I certainly have. So that is, I think, one of the reasons. And also his life was just so colorful. He lived his life at hyperspeed. We tend to think of him as somebody, you actually just said his long life, but it really, in the context of his time, it was a regular life. He died at the age of 60. We would consider that kind of young today.
Sure.
But the amount of things that he crammed into those 60 years is almost unbelievable. Of all the presidents in the United States, the one who wrote the most books was Theodore Roosevelt. He published over 40 books. And he wrote those books himself. He didn't have some ghostwriter writing a book and then he would just slap his name on the cover. He actually wrote them. Now, sometimes he would dictate them. He was very good at dictation. But when you read a book by Theodore Roosevelt, you're reading his writing. It's not something that was prepared for him. He had some help with research on occasion, but it's one of the things I find really fascinating about him is how much he crammed into his life during the 60 years that he had.
Yeah, when you look at the subjects of presidential, presidents that came down the road from that point forward, we think of Lincoln and perhaps Grant because of the war and FDR certainly, but he's got to be one of those presidents that a lot has been written about him, a lot has been said about him in TV programs, documentaries, and things like that. He's got to be up there in the top 10, I would think, of presidents.
Oh, more than that. There's so many, and he's still contemporary with us. So he still deals with issues that are important to us. The amazing role that he played with the establishment of the national park system that we have. He wasn't the first person to do that, but he was the most influential person in terms of the number of parks and wildlife sanctuaries and bird sanctuaries and other types of nature preserves that he created and pushed through in all sorts of interesting kind of clever ways that he was able to get past the reluctant Congress, use the Monuments Act and things like that to make things happen. But that's something we still care about today. He was somebody who was in some ways uncorruptible. And that was one of the things that I think made him kind of mysterious to the politicians of his day, where you had so much political corruption in place, with the payoffs and all of that sort of thing. And that was something that it didn't matter to him. And he was born into money, and it didn't. He wasn't tempted by those sorts of temptations like so many other people were. One of the things that he was instrumental in was creating a system in terms of governmental service that was based more on merit than on connections, based more on competent work rather than kind of a political payoff. When he was brought in to be the police commissioner in New York, well, at that time, the New York police whole department was just riddled with corruption. But he came in and was untempted by all of that. And I think on some level, you're talking about his influence today. But his work as the police commissioner, if you ever watched the TV show Blue Bloods, sure. If you look in the office of Commissioner Reagan, there's always a portrait of Theodore Roosevelt on the wall.
Right. And if you look at his time span, wasn't he around the Teapot Dome scandal, and that was sort of influential for some of his thinking about corruption, especially when he was in Albany and I mean, it was a Teapot Dome scandal. I think that was around that same time, was it not?
The Teapot Dome scandal was a little bit after that, but he was he wasn't responding to other scandals that were sort of par for the course back in those days, and he really tried to figure out a way to respond to that. Sure. And so he had a lot of impact. But when he was the governor of New York, he was very popular at the time. He had a national reputation because of the Rough Riders business in the war in Cuba, but the Republican Party of the time didn't know what to do with him because he was sort of not beholden to the system, to the machine that was really how those political parties operated back in those days. But they didn't know what to do with him because he was so popular. So they said, "Oh, I know. We'll make him the vice president." Then because back in those days, the vice president basically did nothing. But then shortly after he became vice president, the assassination of McKinley took place, and suddenly he was propelled into the presidency. Sure. So it was that whole situation was not how the political operatives thought it was going to turn out.
So we're talking with library people and library leaders and staff. And so how did you do a lot of your research for the project besides the internet? You probably had to do some pretty deep dives into some historical research books and the kind of the genealogy of his life.
Yes, but I did a lot of the research at his home, Sagamore Hill in Long Island, next to the town called Oyster Bay. So my interest in Theodore Roosevelt and his library started about 10 years ago in a roundabout way. So my specialty is actually children's literature and the history and culture of childhood. So my PhD is in American Studies. I'm an English professor, but I have a strong interest in history, especially American history. So one of the authors, the children's authors I like is a man named Kenneth Grahame, who wrote The Wind in the Willows. And I discovered that Kenneth Grahame and Theodore Roosevelt were friends and frequently corresponded. And after Theodore Roosevelt was no longer president, he went to England and visited Kenneth Grahame, and they corresponded back and forth. And this intrigued me. It's like an American president interested in The Wind in the Willows. How did that happen? So I took an interest in that, and I started doing research on Theodore Roosevelt's interest in children's literature. And lo and behold, it was real. It was sincere, and it was in depth. He knew a lot about children's literature. He read children's books. He knew Lewis Carroll. He would quote from Hunting of the Snark. He was really engaged in children's literature. And so I went to Sagamore Hill trying to find out, well, what children's books were in the house? What children's books did they have for their own children? Because, he had a big family. And that's how I got to know the people at Sagamore Hill. which is nowadays a National Park Service site.
So Sagamore Hill is it sort of a default presidential museum for him? I mean, kind of captured the way he lived back then. It's
Well, it totally captures the way he lived.
Yeah.
It's his home. It's the home that he and his wife lived in for their entire adult life. And it was what was amazing about that, what is amazing about that home is that after he died, his wife continued to live there for another 20 years, but she honored his books in his library. She was an avid reader herself, and she had her own room with her own books, but she left his books largely undisturbed in his, what he referred to as his library. But that's a misnomer because the whole house was a library. If you go to Sagamore Hill today, and you can, it's open to the public, almost every room has bookshelves in it. And where the books are located within the house tell you different things about him and his family and his interests. And so I went there initially just to find out about his interest in children's books. But my interest in authors' homes, I have an interest in authors' homes, and I published a book about that. But I became interested in all of his books. Well, you can look into the rooms. If you were to go there, you can look into the rooms, but they're cordoned off and you can't really go in. But I wanted to see the books. I have this character flaw. I think it might be a character flaw, which is if I visit somebody and there's a little lull in the conversation, I'm gravitating toward their bookshelves. I'm looking at what books does this person have? How are those books clumped together? And what do these books, that there's an old saying, the clothes make the man. Well, I think really much more it's the books that make a person. And if you look at their books, the books that are important to them, the books that they display prominently, they are in a sense making a statement about themselves. In fact, we see that today in this world of Zoom. I see you right at this very instant in our interview. There's a bookshelf behind you. I'm trying to make out the titles of the books, but I can't.
I've stolen that from Hemingway. This is Hemingway's house in Key West.
Yeah.
So I'm a Hemingway guy, and so I use the background. I took this picture. It's his home in Key West there, and we were there many years ago and looking at his six-toed cats. And so yeah, I'm a big Hemingway guy. I agree completely with you because if I look at my own bookshelf in my home, it's got stratas. It has, this era I was interested in this kind of sports and this interested in this type of fiction and that. And, here's the books I have, my cookbooks or my books on how to fix things. And it's a puzzle to me. And perhaps you think about this as well, which is you look at libraries and the movement towards the Kindle books and the electronic books and how libraries can give access to those things from people that don't want to go to the library, which is great. But you and I are of the belief that the physical book exists and needs to continue to exist. So, I mean, that's something certainly that Teddy Roosevelt thought about. It's, the physical book needs to exist in a place that people can go and see.
Yes, it was very important to him. The physical book itself was important to him. Another thing that was important to him related to that was he always understood that there is a person behind every book. And he would be intrigued he would read a book a day. He really read a book a day, even when he was president. He was a fanatical reader, and his eyesight was not very good. He would oftentimes read a book with the book really close up to his face. But he had what we sometimes refer to as a photographic memory, which was a little uncanny and disturbing to some of his friends, because he would say, "Oh, you're Steve. Yeah, I read that Safe Libraries book you wrote. But, I thought on page 55 where you said," and then he would start rattling off and you would think, I wrote the book and I couldn't possibly do that.
Wow.
But he could do that with book after book after book after book. It was just a weird gift that he had. But what he would do if he liked a book, if there was a book that appealed to him, he would, and when he was president, he could almost do these command performance things and say, "Oh, well, I like this book that Owen Wister wrote. Hey, Owen, show up. I want to talk to you about the Virginian." And of course he would show up because he was the president. And then he would have people over for dinner and talk to them about the book and question them about it, and really in some ways engage not only with the book, but with the author of the book.
You had to really be on your toes. You couldn't come in and sort of just say, oh, I don't know the answer to that question. I got to study before I meet with the president. He's going to quiz me.
No, you had to be on your toes, and he would judge you if you screwed up. So apparently, one of the stories I liked, Lewis Carroll, of course, we know for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, but he wrote this long, extended poem called "The Hunting of the Snark," which Theodore Roosevelt liked poetry, and he knew that poem really well, better than I know it. And in one of his cabinet meetings, he quoted from The Hunting of the Snark. And there's a line in it that says, if I say something 3 times, then it is true. And so he quoted that in the meeting, and none of the people in the cabinet understood what the heck he was talking about. And this bothered him. It's like, what? You people are all illiterate. He was friends with Edith Wharton, the famous American writer, and she liked Lewis Carroll too. And he had her over for dinner one time, and he said to her, she recalled in her autobiography, he was pleased that I could catch, he liked it if somebody could catch his literary allusions and references. And if you could keep up with him, he enjoyed that. He kind of enjoyed it was almost like a game to him.
If you think about his interest in children's books, is he foreshadowing the value of education there and literacy? And the need for nationwide literacy, and the fact that an educated public, and I mean, is that what he was sort of his goal in putting value behind children's books? It's a stepping stone.
In a way, yes, I think in a way it was important. One of the things that was important to Theodore Roosevelt was he had a very pro-immigrant stand, but maybe not the way we think of it today. He was friends with Jane Addams, and he was a frequent visitor to Hull House, if you remember her famous book, 20 Years at Hull House. But he was very supportive of trying to improve the lives of immigrants. And of course, the time period of his adulthood was when we had these great waves of immigrants from different parts of the world. And he would welcome them, but he always felt that an immigrant population should not renounce their heritage, but embrace being an American. And for one of the ways in which Theodore Roosevelt felt that it was useful for somebody to embrace the country that they had moved to was through reading and becoming familiar with the literature of America. He was really interested in American literature. He was well read. He read all sorts of things. He knew a tremendous amount of European literature and literature from all over the world, but he really put an emphasis on American literature, and he promoted the use and reading of American literature in schools as a way to kind of cultivate. We still are a young country in the grand scheme of things, but a sense of national cultural identity. He would talk about that on frequent occasions. So that was part of his interest in children's literature and promoting children's literature, was to encourage kids to read American literature and figure it out and figure out their place in it. That was part of his initiative. It was also, though, something that he greatly promoted literature with his own kids. He read aloud to his kids, and his wife read aloud as well. When he wrote there's a book that was published right after he died that was called Letters to His Children, Theodore Roosevelt's Letters to His Children. And I own that book, but if you look at those letters, he's making constant references to books that they had read. One of the books that he liked Joe Chandler Harris, and he liked the Brer Rabbit stories, and he would oftentimes make references to Brer Rabbit or some of the other characters from those stories. So for him, it was a way to not just literacy for literacy's sake, but also as a common touchstone that could help us communicate with each other. That was one of the other reasons why he so highly valued books.
Do you have a sense from your research that how he had an impact on libraries and from a national perspective, or at least from a New York perspective? We probably know he probably did a lot for libraries in New York State and New York City. But do you have a sense from your research what he's done for libraries and kind of a raising the value and the awareness in the early part of our world in his time?
Well, I think he was involved in that. He maybe was a bit more involved in the museum world than the library world. He played a really important role in the Smithsonian Institution and New York Library, Natural History Library. If you go to the Natural History Library in New York right now, there's still a statue of Theodore Roosevelt in the interior of the museum. But he believed in these public institutions. His father also did. And he was really influenced by his father. His father was very much engaged in civic life and felt that, they came from money, but he felt that resulted in responsibilities and that you should do something with the money that would better somebody besides yourself. And so he would donate money, and his father donated money to cultural organizations like museums and libraries and organizations like that. He was also a promoter of academic enterprise in a way. He was involved, he was a member, and in fact, he was in some ways the president of the American Historical Association. And he wrote quite a number of books that were about American history. And he felt that we needed to, as Americans, write our own history and realize that we have a story to tell. Now, yes, from a contemporary point of view, his historical works, especially about the settling of the West, which was something that really fascinated him, have a kind of a 19th century sort of feel to them, with the expansion of the West and all of that business was would now be called into question in terms of attitudes toward American Indians and such. But it was something that deeply interested him. And it's kind of hard. I mean, people like to overgeneralize, I think, about people from earlier time periods and label them, and with a simple thing calling people colonials or racist or this or that. But when you really delve into Theodore Roosevelt's life, it was always, yes, he reflected the values of his time and the attitudes of his time, but he pushed the envelope, to use an old cliche. He pushed that envelope beyond what most people would do. For example, he was friends with Booker T. Washington. And when he was president, early on in his presidency, he really liked uproot slavery, and he invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, and then invited him to dinner because he was wanting to talk to Booker T. Washington about his book. Well, that caused an absolute uproar, especially in the South. What is this man doing, inviting a Black person to the White House to have dinner? That was something that just was considered to be unacceptable. But Theodore Roosevelt did not back down off of that. And in fact, invited Booker T. Washington, even after that uproar, to the White House again, a couple of different occasions. So, he thought for himself.
Yeah, he didn't strike me as a guy that looked at opinion polls and cared what people said. He said, I'm going to do what I want. I've got an agenda. He felt strongly about a lot of things. You think about his involvement with the Panama Canal when he was Navy Secretary. When you look at his sort of Wild West life, there's a story I've heard, and maybe you've heard it, and I'm not sure if it's apocryphal, but it sounds fun to me anyway. I think I heard it like on PBS or This American Life or something like that, where he was working as like a sheriff's deputy somewhere, and he had to get some bank robbers from one part of the state to another, and they had to camp out for like 2 and 3 days. And he had these guys handcuffed together, and he fed them, and they had to sit in the boat while he paddled across some place to get them to drop off at this other jail. And it took like 3 days. I mean, he was by himself with these guys that are pretty bad dudes, and he actually got them to the jail. Have you ever heard that story?
Yes, there's some truth to it. So he wasn't working as a deputy or anything official like that, but the Wild West was sort of wild back in those days, and he was involved in the cattle industry, raising cattle and whatnot, and there were lots of problems related to that, and people would steal cattle and whatnot, and so there wasn't a really good system for dealing with people who would do things like that. So people kind of took the law in their own hands, and now that would not necessarily be a good idea, but there really wasn't much alternative back in those days. When he was living in, when he was a rancher living in what is now North Dakota, well, at that time it was the Dakota Territories, which eventually broke into South Dakota and North Dakota. But there wasn't a strong law presence, and so he was operating in that context. The funny thing about that was, while he was doing that, he was reading Anna Karenina. So he had this kind of bifurcated life. He'd be reading this famous work of Russian literature while at the same time dealing with cattle thieves. So he was such a complex person. One of the things I think we need to avoid doing, but it's natural for us to do it, is to engage in a certain amount of hero worship. And so we look at somebody as a hero. That's an impulse, especially when you're younger, to look at somebody as a hero. And then you get a little bit more educated and you realize that not everything they did was wonderful. And then you have the opposite of people saying, oh, well, I used to admire him, but now I don't anymore because he did this or he did that. I think really it's more interesting to look at people for what they really are, which is, I oftentimes refer to people as a bundle of contradictions. And they could say this and they could do that. And, that's just the way people are. Sometimes when you try to see how people reconcile their contradictions or how they move their positions over time, that shows you a certain amount of intellectual character growth in a way. See that with Theodore Roosevelt, with the idea of having women have the right to vote. Well, Theodore Roosevelt was always pro-suffrage, always supportive of women having the right to vote, but it wasn't a big agenda item for him until he became friends with Jane Addams, and she was a big advocate of women having the right to vote. And he changed his tune and said, I'm on board. I'm with you. And in fact, when he ran for president under the Progressive Party, or sometimes known as the Full Moose Party, one of the main things on his platform was that women should have the right to vote. And he was an outspoken advocate for that. But he didn't start out that way. He grew into that position.
Yeah, he just, he strikes me as kind of a superhuman, reading and education and sporting life and the going out into the wilderness and fending for himself and running businesses and doing things, just a larger than life guy. I had an opportunity to interview Story Musgrove, the astronaut, and he at the time he was one of the most traveled astronauts we ever had in the space program, and he worked on the Hubble Space Telescope. Mm-hmm. And you look at that guy; he's got a medical degree, and he's got a astrophysics degree, and I mean he's just superhuman. And so you look, there are people in our lives that come across and just say, I'm going to absorb and just grab everything I have in terms of content and subjects and education and information. He just seemed like one of those guys, multi-literate and of such a variety of things. And that I wonder whether that gift is lost these days, where people are just, I focus on one thing. This guy knows a lot about a lot. And that's why I think he's such a fascinating character.
Yeah, when I wrote Theodore Roosevelt in this library at Sagamore Hill, the end of the book, second half of the book, is a bibliography of every book that is in the house, that is still in the house. Now, that doesn't mean all those books were books that Theodore Roosevelt or his wife owned, but that doesn't mean that was the only books, because, after his death, the kids came and took some of the books, and some of them just disappeared. But when you look at the books that are in his house, still to this day, you can see such a wide range of interests. from things related to science. He was very engaged in science, from things related to history, things related to poetry and classic literature. He was a man of many, many interests. And if he became interested in something, like at one point he became interested in ancient Irish sagas. One of the essays I include in my book about Theodore Roosevelt on books and reading is this long scholarly essay about ancient Irish sagas. And one of the things he liked about these old sagas is that oftentimes they had female protagonists, and that intrigued him. And he wrote about this in this really erudite essay. It's like, how did he become so knowledgeable about this? But if he became interested in something, no matter what it was, he would immerse himself in it. And so if you go and look at the books that are in his house, you can see what a well-read person he was and how diverse his interests were. And that really, I think, enabled him to be able to communicate with so many different kinds of people, because he knew something about basically everything during the time period that he lived.
So your book, Theodore Roosevelt and His Library at Sagamore Hill, you have a companion book to it, and tell me about that one. It's just come out?
Yes, it just came out this year. It's called Theodore Roosevelt on Books and Reading. So Theodore Roosevelt wrote about books that he liked. He was much more comfortable about writing about books than he was about writing about people. So if you read his autobiography, which I have, it's a peculiar autobiography, as you know, because you mentioned it to me. Both his wife and his mother died on the same day.
Yeah, the Valentine's Day, 1884.
Right. If you look at his autobiography, it's not even mentioned. His first wife is not even mentioned. He doesn't write about his personal life at all, but he will write about the books that he loved. In some ways, that's safer territory for him. So I was intrigued by, well, what did he have to say about books, and what books did he write about, and what were his points that he made, and how did he write about them? And so I went through all of his writings, and if you take his writings, they collectively are about 20 volumes long. He wrote a tremendous amount,
right?
But picked the things that were about books or the act of reading, his approach to reading, and collected them. I didn't pick every single thing that he ever wrote on that subject, but I picked enough that I thought would give you a feel for that side of him. One of the things about Theodore Roosevelt is, we think of him as this in terms of this strenuous life and his, camping and hunting and outdoorsman, and that's all true. But he was also a bookish person who would read a book a day. And for him, it was not an either or, it was a both and.
Right.
When he would go out camping or when he would go on a safari, he had books that he brought with him. He would read at the time. He never not read. He was always reading all the time.
Yeah.
And digesting it and processing it, thinking it through. So I collected some of those essays, and he wrote a lot of book reviews. His book reviews were always very celebratory. He would write if he liked a book that you wrote, and he wrote a book review about it. It was always like, this is the best book that was ever written, sort of book review, just the kind of book review you would like if you're the author. But he kind of shows he was interest. I tried to pick out some of the book reviews, because you could do a whole book of his book reviews that showed the different sides of him, the different things he was interested in.
So the Theodore Roosevelt and His Library at Sagamore Hill is published by Rowman and Littlefield. Who did the second book?
Rowman and Littlefield as well.
Oh, okay, Rowman. Okay.
They're sister volumes. I had the same editors and everybody that I worked with, and I don't know, but you might be able to see it, Steve.
Yeah, got some parallels there.
Yeah, they're designed to go together and be sister volumes.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thanks for your comments on Roosevelt. He's such a fascinating character. He's such a larger than life character, and we could talk forever about him getting shot while giving a speech, and just so much that he did in the world just to be a robust guy. How can people get a hold of you?
Well, I teach at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, so I don't make any effort to hide my email or and my contact information. So if you just type in my name, I always use my middle initial. There are so many Mark Wests, including a rather nice wine called Mark West Vineyards. But I am the only Mark I. West in the world. So when I discovered that many years ago, I said, okay, well, for writing purposes, I always use my middle initial. So if you just type in Mark I. West, you can find me. It's very easy to find me.
Great. Thanks a lot for the time and the information, and such a powerful subject that you could look at each facet of his life and find another book there for sure.
Oh, sure. And somebody has. Somebody's written about everything. So, but I was the only person to write about this.
That's right. And that's why we're talking about it.
That I actually found something about Theodore Roosevelt that other people hadn't written about. It just seemed mind-boggling to me that something that had been mined over that thoroughly, that an old children's literature professor could find something other people hadn't gone over. But I think on some level, the book side of Theodore Roosevelt has been overshadowed by the outdoorsman and politician sides of Theodore Roosevelt. And as an academic, as a book person myself, that's the side of Theodore Roosevelt I relate to.
Yeah, thanks for capturing that, Mark, and good to talk with you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation.